Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of IXIASOFT's new webinar series, IXIAtalks. My name is Sydney Jones, Head of Marketing Communications here at IXIASOFT, and I will be your host. This webinar series covers everything from data to agile document management to localization to IXIASOFT's very own CCMS. And we love data, so you can expect a lot of that. Episodes are released periodically and cover a wide range of topics in the telecom industry. Tune in to listen to world-renowned speakers and learn something new. Before we get started, a few housekeeping details. Our webinar is being recorded live, so if you can't make it today, don't worry. A link to the webinar will be available after it airs. As audience members, you are unfortunately muted, so you can cook, clean, eat, work, exercise, do whatever you wish while you listen. Please direct any questions or comments to team.ccms@ixiasoft.com at the end of the webinar. Finally, if you would like to ask a question during the webinar, please type it into the questions section of your control panel in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. We will answer these during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And now our special guest, Sharon Figueira, who is waiting so patiently. She is IXIASOFT's pre-sales technical consultant for North America. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, Sydney. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Great.
Good. So today's episode is titled Getting the Review You Want. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to introduce our guest. So Sharon has 18 years of experience as a technical communications professional, 15 as a manager, with 2 data migrations under her belt, one for Ericsson and one for Kodak. Now that we know a little bit more about Sharon, let's dive into an intro about what it means to get a bad review.
Okay, well, firstly, I just want to emphasize that when you're working in highly technical domains like telecom, networking, or in specialist domains like legal or medical, then every tech writer, even a great tech writer, needs feedback, review feedback to produce high quality content. And I think many of us have had the experience of creating technical documentation and working really hard to understand the domain, the terminology, the specifications, and struggling to get hands-on experience with a product. And then you run into trouble when you try to get the review feedback you need from your subject matter experts. So, sometimes working with partners to produce documentation, it feels like a bit like a dysfunctional relationship where you're doing all the work and the other person is putting in the absolute minimum. But when the doc bugs come in, it's most definitely the tech comms professional on the line. So to summarize, just before we move on, this presentation, what I'm trying to do is describe some of the underlying causes of bad review, the impact, the cost, and some ideas around how you might improve the process and the experience for the reviewers.
Thanks, Sharon. So bad review is a pretty broad term. Can you describe the different types of bad review?
Definitely. So I've categorized it in several ways here. So the first is the totally missing review. This is, of course, very painful when you've just got nothing there at all. Then we've got the not meaningful review. So, you might get comments like, well, it looks fine to me, or that's okay by me. And when you look at the complexity and the density of the text, you know that this person cannot possibly have not found any mistakes. Untimely review is sometimes the worst kind of review. So it comes in so late that you can't use it, but you have to look at all that review feedback and understand all the errors that are going to go out in the documentation because it's too late to stop it. Or worse, it's so critical that however late it is, you've got to do major rewrites close to the deadline. And this is, of course, really problematic because you've got your team there working late into the evening or weekends. And of course, at that point, you're very likely to introduce new errors as you try to do your fixes. And there's obviously no time to do a final check there. Not the review that you were looking for. So this can range from things like reviewers doing a complete copy edit, finding every typo, putting in extra commas, despite the fact you've got a very well qualified editor who's going to do all that. Or it can range right through to a complete rethinking of the entire documentation strategy. So, this is where you have somebody come into your office and say, hey, why are we doing this? Let's just put it all on YouTube. And I've actually already put it up there on a channel. And you have to kind of talk people back down to the strategy. Not the right focus. So this is very difficult because you may have people who actually put in tons of work they have very little time, they work very hard, but they have focused on old content or content that hasn't changed in this release and was previously reviewed, or they've reviewed content that you've given to somebody else to review, it's just completely the wrong focus. And conversely, good review is rigorous, it's on time, and it's focused on the target content.
So I'd imagine that a mistake caused by a bad review might have some dire consequences. Is that right?
It certainly does. And I think the first issue that I want to just sort of raise here is that it is much cheaper to fix bugs in early phases of development. So here are two visuals, one from hardware and one from a software design textbook. And they show the exponentially increasing costs of finding bugs in the later phases of development. So in the table at the top, if the cost of fixing the bug during the design phase is $1,000, it increases by a factor by 1,000,000 if you're doing something like building a space rocket. In the graph below, you can see the last bar shows this giant increase in the cost of fixing a bug after the software has been released rather than before it's been released. And our own Ginny Reddish, she applied these techniques. It's quite old, but it's still very true. The thing that's probably changed is the cost of doing this. So Ginny Reddish did some analysis and said that if you find a bug in the edit cycle or the review cycle, then it's going to be, if that is 1, then it will go up to about 25 times the cost once you have to fix it when it's out in the field.
Okay, so Sharon, do you have any stories of particularly brutal bad review mess ups? I mean, how bad can it really get?
Well, I dug around a little bit and I had a look at, obviously the major exploratory space missions that they tend to, if they go wrong, they go very, very wrong. So the first one was the Mariner probe, and this one was the investigators, they traced the cause of the accident here to an error in the guidance control software. And what it did was transmit a series of incorrect course correction signals. And the vehicle it went off its flight trajectory. The the range safety officer had to just detonate the spacecraft in 5 minutes after liftoff because they basically had no control over it, and there was a risk of it crashing into the local towns. And the reason is slightly mysterious about what happened, but the most detailed and consistent account is that there was a faulty equation, and the error was a hand transcription of a mathematical symbol. It's supposed to be a missing overbar. So finally, when calculating all the adjusted costs of research, development, training, and construction in today's numbers, the total losses connected to the accident here are about $620 million. So the next one I found also NASA. This I'm sure a good technical writer would have caught this, really. The Disaster Investigation Board looking into the NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter, it appeared that they had 2 sets of engineers and there was a failure to convert into common units. So one team was working in English units and the other team was working in metric units. So the software that calculated the force the thrusters needed to exert, and it's calculated in pounds of force. So we had one calculating in pounds of force and the other one in newtons. And because of this, the climate orbiter burned up in the Martian atmosphere at a cost of finally 125 million USD.
Okay, so on this next slide, I'm seeing milk. How can anything possibly go wrong with something as harmless as milk?
Well, this is actually more of an edit issue, but I like this one because of its focus on the serial comma, which is close to the hearts of all technical writers, I know. So the issue is that if you see the quote here, this is an agreement between Oakhurst Dairies and their drivers, and you can see that there is no comma after the word shipment. So if there is no comma there, it means that the packing for shipment or distribution here is a single activity. And truck drivers do not pack food either for shipment or distribution. They drive trucks and deliver the milk. So these exemptions do not apply to drivers, and Oakhurst Dairy owes them $10 million.
Wow. Okay. So, as a side note, if any of you listening have your own bad review nightmare stories, we would love to hear them, and we encourage you to share them with us at team.ccms@ixiasoft.com for inclusion in future presentations. Don't worry, you can change the names and the faces of the guilty. Again, a quick reminder that if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the questions section of your control panel in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So moving on, I think the next logical step is to tackle the why behind bad review.
So starting with documentation is undervalued. So very often collaborators fail to deliver good review because the organization itself does not value documentation. And there's an implicit message that tasks related to documentation are just less important than other tasks. And this message is very clear to reviewers and collaborators who focus on the tasks that their own managers value, that their performance review is evaluated on, and so on. You may also see things like it's hard for you as a tech pubs manager to get a seat at the table when decisions are made and strategies are defined and so on. It's kind of hard to make the voices of the tech comms team heard, and it's hard to get time or executive support. And all of these are indicators that your company doesn't really value documentation very highly. And really, this is a whole other podcast on how to tackle this. But I did see this done very effectively by my previous boss at Ericsson. And she did a really good job communicating the value of tech pubs by asking our customers to estimate the value of our documentation to them. And she did this by putting out a survey. So you can check her article. It's in Funding Models, Creative Approaches to Resourcing. It's in Best Practices, June 2018. And I reference this later in the slides if you want to find that and see how she approached this. Secondly, collaborators struggle with the format or the interface. We often ask our collaborators to learn how to navigate our document repositories. Sometimes we ask them to learn our authoring tool. We often ask them to handle unfamiliar interfaces. And given that very often they're squeezing this in alongside doing other jobs, this is a big barrier. Collaborators are not held accountable. So thirdly, here, doc bugs are most definitely the problem of the tech comms team. And it's very rare that reviewers are held accountable for errors in the documentation. In fact, very often the reviewer is oblivious to the outcomes of bad review. Once the reviewer does the review, then they're off the hook and they don't hear any more until it's time to review the documentation again. So if you're not held accountable and you don't know when things go wrong, then that can mean that you don't really think that you have to work very hard at review. Finally, sometimes reviewers try really hard, but they just focus on the wrong content. As I said before, carefully proofreading, looking for any typos and grammatical errors, reviewing the content you assign to someone else. And this can sometimes happen, when you're asking them to pick through something like a large PDF. You're saying just do these few sections, and somehow, between getting that PDF and rushing to do the review, the instructions kind of get lost. So that was my final point there.
So Sharon, how can a team that is prone to giving bad reviews improve? Is it possible to get better?
it's definitely possible to improve this, and I think it's sort of a carrot and a stick approach here. So firstly, make it easy to review. Provide low barrier tools. Don't ask people to learn DITA, your interface, your authoring tool, or pick their way through SharePoint to the document you need them to focus on. Be really respectful of your resources' time. So get them to focus just on the key content, just the content that they're expert in, just the content that's changed for this release. This is rather than asking them to find new content in a PDF or review just content you list or so on. Support reviewers and think about their experience. How does it feel from their point of view to be trying to do this review? And I've got some ideas that I'll get into later in the slideshow here, but you can do things like use templates, provide coaching, do one-on-one support, and make sure they know what's not required, and also think about providing some kind of parking lot. So, if they have brilliant ideas about how to revolutionize the way you do documentation, then give them a place to put that as opposed to, always just shutting it down. The stick part here is holding your reviewers accountable. So how do you do that? The first thing is being able to track what was reviewed, by who, and when. Being prepared to analyze your doc bugs and look for root cause analysis here, and asking some tough questions. Is that a failure? Did the reviewer not catch this? Or did the reviewer catch this and the writer didn't put it in? Did the writer somehow manage to reject or omit the changes that were given? Was there a misunderstanding between the writer and the reviewer about what should happen? How do you fix that? How do you fix that relationship or the process? And finally, provide bad review as a cause for bugs and make that transparent to senior management. For example, having as a cause for your bugs things like missing review, poor review, incomplete review, and being prepared to be vocal about that.
So what is the best solution? How do you address this issue?
Okay, so this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion here because I'm showing our new web IXIASOFT CCMS interface. But there are lots of ways to lower the bar and lots of ways to reduce the amount of know-how a reviewer needs to interact with your world. So for example, you can get granular by delivering just the bits in PDF that you need them to review and to give them this sort of key granular content. And there are many tools that are moving in this direction, and I think you'll find similar low entry tools, especially where you want people to interact with DITA content. So why is this a great interface? So, and this is the sort of thing you want to be looking for. So firstly, the content is super easy to find. You can see in the list, that's the list of topics that are assigned to somebody to review. So we're not giving them PDFs, we're giving them the actual topics, and you can see there's context. So even though we're reviewing topic by topic, you can read all the other content. You can't access it to review it, to change it, but you can read it and see where your content sits in the whole publication. The key information is visible. You can see the due date is really clear. You can sort by the due date, so you can work through the most urgent to the least urgent. You can see who sent it to you, things like that. And it's an intuitive interface. There's not a huge amount going on here. It's very simple, and you can see there's really only two action buttons here. One is the pencil button, and that's your edit. So it's very, very easy to get into to find where you need to go to do that the review and the editing. Again, so here with this interface here, you can see that it's very familiar. It's super intuitive. You've got this sort of ribbon menu along the top, which is kind of a bit like a wiki maybe, or Confluence, or it's very easy to get into that and start making changes. You can see that we use track changes. So it's a familiar concept. Most people are familiar with track changes. In our instance here, the change would be accepted by the content owner or the tech pods person, accepted or rejected, of course. And again, the next step is really clear. What else can you do? Well, you can go and check that topic in. So very easy to collaborate using this. And again, here you can see that simple, intuitive interface that I showed you at first. And then for our collaborative review functionality, which you can see now, that supports multiple reviewers to review in real time. So in the right panel, you can see the review comments from other reviewers. And if you're reviewing if you're all reviewing the document, in the actual same time period, then you'll see the review comments coming in live and appearing in the list there on the right. And I think that potentially what you could get here is that it's so good for the writers. So instead of sending out 10 PDFs and saying can you review sections 2, 7, and 11 and can review it number 2, can you review section 23, and then you get all these PDFs back and you have to collate all this information, and inevitably somebody's reviewed a whole bunch of other stuff, and now you've got to try and work out you've got 3 different review comments on a single paragraph and they're all different, and you have to go and try and work out who's right. So I hope here, that people can discuss conflicting comments as they are made, and they resolve them before it comes to the tech writer to have to sort of run up and down the building, either virtually or in reality, trying to work out, who's right on the conflicting review. Lastly, you can also archive the collaborative review comments, and you can keep that review with all of the comments in the same repository, and that gives you this key traceability.
So I'd imagine that it would be a big waste of time. I mean, if people are reviewing the same content that has already been reviewed, how do you track that from product release to product release?
Right. So it's easier to do this if you're already in a topic-based information architecture like DITA, but it's definitely worth putting in some extra time to achieve an end result in other architectures. The end result being, where you can track review at a component level rather than a document level. So if you have a system with a workflow, and I'm showing a screenshot here from IXIASOFT. So you can see, the workflow here. I've got all my topics which are at complete, and they've been at complete since the last release. I know that they have gone through a whole document development cycle, including review and approval. So they haven't changed in this release. They're just going to stay there. They're not active at all. And I've got just 3 topics there that have changed in this map, and they have moved to a review workflow. So it's really clear to me that these are the only 3 topics that are in scope to be reviewed. I'm not going to ask anybody to re-review content that hasn't changed. It's very easy for me to track that. So in summary, whatever your tool is, the objective you should aim for is to give your reviewers just the new and changed content requiring their particular area of expertise.
So what barriers might your collaborators be facing?
So firstly, a lot of collaborators and reviewers, in your test organization, your QA organization, or your engineering organization, these are the science guys, the STEM people, and sometimes they're not like us, who tend to come from if not an arts background, definitely a background where you really enjoy language and you really like to write. So our reviewers and our collaborators, sometimes they lack confidence about language skills, and obviously you get people who are just fantastic writers in the QA test and engineering organizations too, but generally you may find that your people are a little they're less keen to put their English in the spotlight. This is particularly true if you're working with people who come from other countries or have English as a second language. Often, places at university, key jobs, a lot of it can hinge on the level of English you have. And so sometimes people just sort of habitually just avoid putting their English in the spotlight because, it's so high stakes for them. So we need to sort of think about that and talk about that. Then we lack of time. So sometimes lack of time is actually about the organization not valuing documentation. People don't have time because they're not given time. It's kind of a volunteer task or a task that is not scheduled in any way. So that's something to bear in mind. But it's also very, very important to communicate about review deadlines in advance and help reviewers plan their time. And so I would try to give reviewers a heads up about a month ahead that they're going to have some review tasks to do, and then give them another reminder a week ahead of the handoff date, and then give them reminders about the due date once review has started. It's due in a week, it's due in 3 days, whatever. And you obviously have to be careful not to overwhelm people with email, but be careful to communicate and help them manage their time. Another barrier is struggling to find the right scope for review, and I did find that people were not sure. Were they supposed to catch every error? I had some long discussions with my reviewers who, felt they were responsible for the grammar. I had to explain they really weren't. So, don't make assumptions that they understand what's expected of them in every case. Supporting your reviewers. So, think about doing some coaching. You can do face-to-face where the writer who is responsible for the content, if they're co-located, they could go and sit with them and work through some of the content together and try to sort of guide on the review that you need. Think about things like a forum or a wiki page or a Slack channel or peer review. If you've got a really great reviewer or collaborator, then get that person to help other people in their team to do review and sort of guide them to what's really needed. Make sure that you clearly identify the scope, give some guidelines about what is and is not required. And if you can, you can provide them with some kind of template or examples of good input. I have an example, a summary of what I've done on the next slide. So this is a sort of a summary of the support we gave as a team to when we were trying to get people to help us review bugs, in our release notes. So firstly, I had a wonderful IA, Fiona Hannington, and she came up with this great sort of template. So it's a bit simplified here, but it was sort of like symptom of the bug, the trigger, the workaround, and so that the collaborators, they had sort of something to start with. They were to describe these 3 items. And then, an example, give them an example, you might show how the tech writer drafts the example, the review input that the reviewer might give. So, it can be pretty informal because the tech writer is going to handle all the sort of style and the customer facing language and so on. Something about what reviewers do, something about what reviewers don't do, and give them an example of a good of something that they're aiming for, a good target bug, so that they understand really basic things like it doesn't have to be a page long, or it doesn't have to be super formal or scientific language or super technical, or whatever it is that that is a good example.
So it does seem a little unfair that tech writers are held accountable for bugs caused by bad review. How do you deal with that?
Okay, so starting with this, the table on the top right here, this is from my previous role at Ericsson, and it describes gates which we called F gates, and our new features had to pass each F gate in order to be included in the release. So each gate had pass-fail criteria, and we were able as a team to get documentation criteria inserted into that list. So you can see in the final gate F4, this is where the code is committed to mainline and the feature is essentially accepted into the release. And you can see that the criteria for the docs was that the docs had to have completed technical review and verification. So this was just a huge step forward, and I think only a handful of times did I have to block that F4. I had to be prepared to use that. And what I did was there was a sort of a dress rehearsal before it went to the meeting in front of the executives. So at the rehearsal meeting, which came a week before the actual meeting, that's when I said I'm going to block this feature. There's been no tech review. I'm not prepared to release the documents without review. I had good support from the leader of that meeting, and who completely understood that just as you would never release code that has not been reviewed, you should not release documentation that's not been reviewed. So I did this block thing literally maybe twice actually, and it just never happened again because everybody understood that they wanted to get their feature into the release on time and smoothly. And so the managers of the team started to drive. They would check in: has tech review been done? So we got a compliance improved massively once we had tech pubs was in that list. So moving on to the large chart. So this is a graph which we shared at Ericsson's weekly bug management meeting. And this chart shows our doc bugs. So, there's always a lot of effort and communication around bugs and their status as you run up to the release. And very often doc bugs are excluded from those bug counts. And, it can be very intense. I've been in some meetings where people have been in a lot of trouble about bugs, and it can feel very unpleasant. And you think, I'm so glad that's not me, having my feet held to the fire along with all the other managers. But the result actually is that no one cares about your invisible doc bugs, and it's therefore really hard to get help where the bugs are caused by poor or missing review. So communicate about doc bugs using the same mechanisms as the rest of your engineering team, as the same mechanisms the product uses. And these are things like reports, dashboards. Make sure that however management is assessing, where your company is on in terms of product release and bugs, that they know where the doc bugs are too. And I remember this very clearly the first day that the doc bugs, that's CPI in the diagram here, we reported them along with all the other bugs. And when the meeting finished, the phone rang and my VP was on the phone. He was a really great guy too, but it was great to have him on the phone going, okay, I'm responsible for these bugs. What's going on? Why is there an uptick? And so I got the time with him to explain that I was missing review. And I got the time to explain why it was important to get review. And I tried to use test terminology, the same terminology as the rest of the product. And I got him on side and I got him on the warpath. He immediately went off and phoned people and said, why have you not done this review? And they did the review really fast. So, just ensure that the bugs caused by review failure are called out, or you have a way of talking about this. And I do want to emphasize, it's not about pointing fingers. It's about being open about the obstacles, about doing root cause analysis, and about getting help to overcome the obstacles. And just a quick check there. The article that I was talking about, which also describes doing surveys to assess the value of documentation by Debbie Roma. So that's that same article that I'm quoting there. Yeah, so moving on there. Traceability and transparency is key if you're going to be able to do this. So what I'm showing here is that every object in the system here is listed in this table. So it's really important when you're having problems that you find a way that it's easy for you to go back and find out how did these issues come about in the documentation. So in this table, what you can see is that we track the name, the contact details, the timestamp, time and date stamp rather, the user's comment and the system comment about what happened with every revision, in this case to a topic in the system. And that's true of every object in the system. So this is the kind of transparency that you're looking for in traceability, where you can go back and see, okay, a review happened. The writer says she took in the changes, and then I can actually even compare these two revisions to see, did the writer do what she said? Was there some kind of hiccup there? What did the review comments say? So in this screenshot, you can see how collaborative review, it records what every reviewer says, and we had a look at that a bit earlier. But this entire artifact is, you can save that in the repository for as long as you need. So, and very often I did find that it took a long time sometimes for docbugs to come in. And, if you're working with organizations like, big telecoms or whatever, then, somebody like France Telecom might take 2 years to put a release through a lab. And so 2 years later, that's when they started finding things. You can go back into your repository and look for that review and dig through and see, did everybody approve? Did everybody review this? Like, how did we miss this? And again, not to sort of point fingers, but to find out, what went wrong? How can we improve?
So to reiterate for our audience, Sharon, what are the key takeaways from this presentation?
I think the key things that to focus on is, firstly, the carrot. Support your reviewers, give them easy to use tools, clear process, communicate about timing, respect their time, try to give them some task context, and be prepared to do some coaching or to provide coaching in some way. Really target your content, aim to give the right content for the right reviewer. Try to find a way not to give them the giant PDF and ask them to pick through it or send them into old content. On the stick side, hold your reviewers accountable. It's a collaboration. It's just not possible to produce high quality documentation in really technical environments without input and collaboration. And then don't be afraid of the bugs, leverage your bugs. The bugs are opportunities, bugs and errors, to help you do root cause analysis and to improve the review process. And finally, find ways to communicate the value of documentation and the cost of the errors if you have errors in documentation.
Okay, so thank you, Sharon. We'll now be moving on to the question section of the presentation. Again, a quick reminder that you can type a question into the question section of your control panel in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and we will answer them right away. So we have one question here, Sharon. Did getting your boss to call people for not reviews have any negative impact on your future relations with the people who owed the reviews? There are definitely repeat offenders, IMHO. Not sure if your experience is that this method works to change a repeat offender's poor response rate.
Well, the great thing was that it wasn't me calling them, and I wasn't saying I'm going to call your manager. It was that it came about because the bugs were reported at the meeting, the bug review meeting, and then the VP was like, well, why is this happening? And asked me why it was happening, and then went to the reviewer. So it didn't feel like, I didn't feel like I was throwing this person under the bus, or these people actually under the bus. It kind of just came out naturally from being really transparent about them. It was definitely much better than other ways I tried, where I'd actually, started doing things like saying, I still don't have your review, and CCing the person's manager. Then that person, in some cases, did feel a bit resentful and felt that, I had kind of pointed the finger at them and got them into trouble and everything. So the other way was much better than any other way I had found to, hold that reviewer accountable.
Okay, so the next question is, how do you get the list of reviewers into the CMS?
Well, that's they're in the CMS because they are users in the system. So, however you add users to the CCMS, then you will add your reviewers, and then they are available for you to assign stuff to. You just simply right-click on a topic and go through an assign to process, and the reviewer will be there for you to assign to. a map or a topic. They have to be in the system, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Have you heard of any security concerns from exposing a group list within the reviewer?
No, because within the repository, exposing a group list with the reviewer. Well, all of the names would be within the system, So the system itself, with the names of the reviewers, is secure. Secure, either behind your firewall or on an AWS secured system. So there is no sense of the names being exposed outside of the company or our system. If it's if you don't want to expose the names of reviewers to other reviewers, I think that would be difficult to do, although there is a way that you can set security on entire sort of product line. So if you had like a top secret product or something, and you didn't want anybody to know about it, then you can actually set security so that only the people in the top security team, can even know that it exists, or that there's who's working on it. So maybe you might need to send me an email on that. We can have a little chat about that, if that's not helping. Yeah.
So the next question is, and we'll only take a few more here. So if you have any questions, please type them in now. How did you train your SMEs, subject matter experts, to use the new system? What hurdles did you face?
So I haven't trained any SMEs in this system. I'm the pre-sales consultant. So I'm not sure if that would be a really great thing to get some of our customers in to do a follow-up chat maybe about how you go about doing that. I would say though that I've used, when I go to conferences, some of you may have attended the test kitchens that I do at Best Practices or DIT in North America or something. And what I do is I give people access to the web interface. I just give them like a user ID, and they can just log into a trial system. And people just, maybe 9 times out of 10, they just start editing. They go in, they see what's assigned to them. They're like, oh, there's the edit button. They click the edit button. They go into the topic. I have track changes configured to be on, by default, which you can also do in the system. They start typing. They go, oh, track changes. They look at the ribbon menu, and and I usually give people tasks, like they have to edit something or write something. And normally people are just, they just don't need any training. Mainly the problems are about the 1 out of 10 would be about logging in, not about how to navigate through the system. So I would love to hear from customers who are training their SMEs to work in the web interface. But in that kind of context, my experience has been, it really is low barrier. And that, of course, that was our objective. We didn't want people to have to understand DITA or to have a complex sort of interface to navigate in order to start editing the content.
Okay, so one of our last questions here, how much discussion do you think is reasonable on review input? Like, is this necessary, especially when you get feedback on formatting or structure? Simply put, you disagree totally. Would you try and discuss the point, or rather accept and move on to make things not too difficult?
With things like formatting, I mean, the whole sort of like, I think this title should, not have cap or whatever it was, then I would put in an initial effort, and I would actually try to do this at the team level. So if you're able, or if you have a writer who's co-located, to go to the QA team meeting or the test team meeting, or wherever the person sits, and then sitting with their managers, explain to people that they are wasting their time with the formatting and the proofreading, and explain to them why they don't need to do it. If you're in DITA, that the formatting happens afterwards. That you have a whole edit cycle, so they don't need to worry about the proofreading, and that they can, and try to explain what they need to focus on. I think it's good to do that with a whole team and with the manager there, so because I don't know, sometimes it becomes a little bit of a sort of a wrangle between two individuals, and it needs to be tech pubs is telling, QA, uh, this is the way we're going to handle this. Maybe even have a chat with the manager beforehand and explain, the wastage here, which is so frustrating. But I totally agree. At a certain point, you just need to move on, I guess. Yeah. Oh, actually, one thing that might help with that in our, this is in our system. I'm not sure if the question it comes from is one of our customers, but in the upcoming release, we're going to include you're going to be able to include a CSS so that when they're in the web tool there, when they're looking at the documentation, it's going to look exactly as it would do when it's formatted for release. So if they're working in HTML or whatever, they're going to see, your logo and your colors. So, that also may help to reduce the wastage around things like formatting.
Okay, so this is our final question. I think it's a short one. Was Sharon to share funding models article link? Sharon?
It's I can't. You have to have access to the best practices magazine in order to get to that. But I'll definitely share a link. Can I do that, Sydney, after the?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Can
yeah, we can
send you
send
one,
out.
Joseph.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very, very good article, and I really recommend reading it. Yeah, it's that's my ex-boss from Ericsson. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And Sharon, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. This webinar has been great. Our next webinar is called Creating a Content Inventory. It's scheduled for January 24th, 2019, and will feature special guest and data expert Lee White. So follow us on Twitter, check out our website, and stay in touch for updates. If you'd like to be featured in one of our webinars or you have a unique topic idea, please get in touch at team.ccms@ixiasoft.com. We'll see you in the new year.